one thing was that Chernobyl was a very important part in the history of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The mobilization of the Ukrainian society, the creation of Ruch, the movement for the independence of Ukraine, started with mobilization around ecological issues, and in particular Chernobyl. And leaders of Ruch, like Ivan Drach, were saying that, well, without Chernobyl and mobilization around Chernobyl, there would be no Ruch. So in that sense, what happened in Ukraine had a major impact on the fate of the Soviet Union, and Chernobyl and the end of the Soviet Union are really interconnected. I suspected that that was the case. I didn't know that that was true, that that was for fact, and my research convinced me that indeed that was the case. Another very important theme in that book is the relationship between the nation and society and nuclear energy as a whole. And Ukraine went through a number of stages in its formulating its relationship to nuclear energy. First, it started with a love story. The nation was joining the club of nuclear nations. The leaders of the government, the Ukrainian writers and poets loved it. And then Chernobyl happened, the explosion of the fourth reactor. And the views and relationship between these people who represented nation to a degree and nuclear power changed dramatically. Nuclear power was viewed as something that was killing and destroying the nation. And by 1990s, there was another turn. In the conditions where the economy was in the free fall, the same people who advocated for nuclear-free status for Ukraine, who advocated for closure of all nuclear plants, now became actually supporters of the idea that those nuclear plants should work as long as possible, including Chernobyl plant. So that raises a big question about, again, how countries and states relate to nuclear energy. And we know, for example, that Germany decided to go nuclear-free. At the same time, France, 75% of their electrical energy comes from nuclear. Ukraine is somewhere in between, or maybe more closer to France. In the land of Chernobyl, 50% of our electrical energy comes from nuclear. So we are involved, invested, and dependent on nuclear energy more than most of the countries in the world. So that's something that stays with us. And unfortunately, one of the conclusions of the book is that the accidents like Chernobyl one can happen again because Chernobyl was also the product of a very particular type of the political system and economic system. It was authoritarian regime in the Soviet Union that had full control over the information. The accidents smaller than Chernobyl, but similar to it, that happened before, one of them took place in 1975, another in 1957, were really kept secret, including from the people in the industry itself. So there was no opportunity to change certain things, to adjust. And when you look today where the most nuclear power plants being built, it's not the so-called First World or even the former Soviet Union where the societies, the industries have experience with nuclear energy. It's Middle East. It's volatile politically, it's volatile in terms of there are seismic zones there, but it's the new frontier of nuclear, and it's also the region dominated mostly by the authoritarian regime. So the book doesn't end on a very optimistic note.
And when you're reading your book, you really feel a lot of empathy, in fact, to the people who were there. Right. So they are considered to be villain, a lot of people in the nuclear industry and in the leadership of the Ukrainian Soviet Republic and the USSR, but among them, about those who actually you feel that they were heroic. So what also you would like to say and let us know with that? And that's not exactly how you now relate to that time.
Well, again,
despite of the general myth of the heroes who saved, but we're speaking about the particular people who were on the place.
Well, this book is a work of history. It's contemporary history. It goes all the way almost up until today. This year they're supposed to finish the construction of the new sarcophagus, of the new shelter over Chernobyl reactor, but it's a work of history. And one of the tasks of the historian is just go beyond the layers of mythology. And that's what I was trying to do, looking at the particular context, at the circumstances in which those people worked. And despite the fact that really Chernobyl is the explosion itself not just destroyed the communist system, but was a result of that communist system. But when you look at the people who represented that system, it's very difficult to divide them into heroes and villains, because very often they were both. And I started the book with the story of the director of the nuclear power plant, Mr. Burkhanov, who doesn't fit either of these categories, and that's why he didn't end up in what Svetlana Alexievich was writing about Chernobyl, or even Yuri Sherbak before that. He's at the same time a person responsible for what happened as the director, but he was also ended up to be a scapegoat who was put in prison for the really faults and problems that were not of his own creation. And one of those was the problems with the design of the reactor, which was unsafe from the very beginning. So in that sense, again, I wanted to go as deep as possible into the time, into the circumstances of the time, and understand really the sources of heroism of those people, but also the sources of the problems, the sources of the tragedy. The English edition of the book has tragedy in the title, American doesn't have. So the sources of that tragedy.
I'll still use a chance to ask about just one question on one of your books, also recent. It's on the assassination of Stepan Bandera, a Ukrainian leader of nationalism, which had been done on the German soil and by the Soviet Secret Service. And when you read it, we're doing that in the times of Skripal, in the times of what's happening now. So really what we can know still, because the Soviet KGB is a very closed system, but your book is like eyes-opening. So what we can find out and learn from those archives on what's happening today?
Well, first of all, this book is about the height of the Cold War. So the assassination, one of the assassinations, the character in this book kills two leaders of the Ukrainian immigration, Lev Rebet and Stepan Bandera. So the first assassination took place in '57, another in '59, and then there was a trial of the assassin in 1962, around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it's the height of the Cold War, and it's also the height of the war between the intelligence services, Soviet, American, German, West German in particular, and we are now in the middle of what some people call New Cold War, or return of the Cold War. And in that sense, when you look at the methods that were used back then, they seem to be very familiar with what is happening today. We are again in the age, as you pointed, in the age of assassinations that are very directly linked again to Moscow and to Kremlin, like it was the case back in 1962. You are also in the age of the so-called active measures that really become a hallmark of the KGB activities in late 50s and early 60s, and which now receive their continuation in this new world of internet and ability to cross the borders between the states, between the worlds with the help of the internet. So there are differences in technology, certainly. There are differences in some methods, but there are also parallels. And again, when I was working on that book, I couldn't imagine that it would be so timely in that particular sense.
And finally, one of the bestsellers, I have it in Ukrainian, it's The Gates of Europe. It's comprehensive history of modern Ukraine, not very well known in the West. And so two questions in one. First of all, so really, how would you describe the Ukrainian political nation for the Western audience? Is it already created? Is it this young nation? Because the history goes for, it's almost 2,000 years. But Ukraine is considered to be a very new nation. So how you combine that? And I will ask the chance to say that there are a lot of debates still about the history of Crimea. So what also the Western audience doesn't maybe know through the very big and established narrative of the Russian narrative on the Crimean history?
Well, the term nation itself used differently, let's say, in Britain and in Europe on the one hand and the United States on the other. And in the US, nation means a country. And from that point of view, Ukraine is a very new nation as an independent country. It really appeared on the map for a longer period than just a few months in 1991. They appeared before that in 1919, but that was a short period of time. So it's a new nation from that point of view, as a state, as an independent state. But in terms of its roots, cultural, in particular cultural, I talk and write a lot about culture, they're really very deep. They're very deep. They're also deep in terms of the formation of the modern Ukrainian national project, which starts in most of the countries of Europe and in particular East Central Europe in the 19th century. And it was one of my tasks, first of all, to introduce to the Western reader and American reader in particular this new nation, but also show its historical roots and its origins. And Crimea is part of that story. When you look at the territory of Ukraine, internationally recognized territory of Ukraine, Crimea has more history than any other part of Ukraine. It starts with Herodotus, who writes about Crimea and also writes about Olbia, so it's part of today's southern Ukraine in the region of Odessa. So these are some of the areas of Ukraine that we know the most historically. And in that sense, if you don't include Crimea, if you don't include southern Ukraine into the history, into that narrative of history, it doesn't have the beginning. It's just cut off. You start later, and then you don't really understand a lot about Ukrainian history, because Ukrainian history very much it's about the history of the country, of people who are in the process of moving toward the sea, to the Azov Sea and Black Sea, and it comes certainly with the history of the Cossacks, and you see the Vikings who come to Kiev and create the state. Why they do that? They create it on the road to Constantinople, on the road to the Black Sea. So if you don't have Black Sea, if you don't have Crimea, if you don't have southern Ukraine, wherever you start Ukrainian history, first of all, you start it in the wrong place, but also it doesn't make sense. The Cossacks and their seagoing expeditions and their war against the Crimean Khanate has no sense, and their origins can't be explained without looking at the Crimea. So Crimea is really very important for Ukrainian history. But Crimea is also important for the world history as a whole. That's also which makes Ukrainian history really international and integrated into history of Mediterranean, into the history of Europe, into history of the world later with the Crimean War of the 19th century. So it works both ways.